A 4-star general, a funeral, a gun in her face. No war zone, just a cemetery in America, and a white officer who didn't believe a black woman could outrank him. She didn't flinch. She didn't fight. But what happened next shook the military, the media, and the meaning of silence itself. That morning, Fair Lawn National Cemetery was draped in a thin veil of mist, as quiet as the final breath of a soldier departing this world. The American flag flew at half-mast, not waving, but leaning as if bowing its head. The ground beneath the neat rows of black chairs was still damp from the rain the night before. People don't cry loudly at ceremonies like this. They sit still, back straight, hands clenched tightly around a triangle-folded flag, perhaps because the one in the casket had fallen far away. And now, all that remained was silence and honor. A black SUV glided into the western section. Its engine barely made a sound, leaving only a faint dry trail across the wet grass. The rear door opened. A tall, slender black woman stepped out, dressed in a formal general's uniform adorned with rows of medals on the lapels. Her hair was closely cropped. Her cap sat precisely. She wore no sunglasses. Her face was bare, exposed to the sun, exposed to the gaze of others. And unmistakable, Elise Harrington, 4-star general, a living legend. She stepped forward. No entourage, no escort, no prior announcement. On her left shoulder, the stars of lieutenant general were fastened with perfect precision, each one a memory of battlefield, blood, and survival. In her hands, a small black cloaked urn, meant to rest beside the casket of Kendrick Hale, a soldier who had once been her student, her comrade, a piece of her own flesh and blood. Her gait was unhurried but heavy, as if each step was taken across a chapter of history, not to revive glory, but to bury truths never spoken. 2 young guards nearby raised their hands in salute, almost by reflex. A few aging veterans, their backs bowed by time, pushed themselves upright with canes. No one remained seated, as the woman who had commanded them in Operation White Birch, 2011, the mission that brought 23 U.S. soldiers home alive under enemy fire, walked past. But one man didn't rise. Gavin Renshaw, 42, regional security officer for the West Quadrant, stepped quickly into her path as if executing a routine lockdown. He didn't care who she was, didn't ask, didn't want to know. To him, only 2 things mattered: her dark skin and her gender. A pale, freckled hand slapped the hood of Elise's SUV with a sharp thwack, a sound that cracked through the stillness like a slap across the face of the morning. "Stop. This area is for family," Renshaw barked, his voice low and hard, staring into her eyes with unfiltered disdain. He didn't ask her name, didn't offer a salute. He just stood there, blocking her path, hand casually resting on the grip of his sidearm. Elise didn't move. No flinch. No protest. She quietly reached into her black leather wallet and drew out a military ID card, a special issue badge reserved for active ranking generals. She held it out, steady between 2 fingers. Her hand didn't tremble. Renshaw glanced at it, didn't read, couldn't ignore the 4 stars gleaming on her shoulder. But still, he scoffed. "Nice fake. Everyone wants to play general these days." The officer's words rang loud enough for the first 3 rows to turn. A little girl in a miniature uniform standing beside the casket tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mom, why is that man yelling at the lady?" Her mother didn't answer. She only bowed her head low, gripping the folded flag in her lap, so tightly it looked as though she might crush it. Elise didn't pull her hand back. Her expression didn't change. But her eyes froze the air itself. And then she spoke, her voice low and resonant, clear as the toll of a bell echoing through stone. "You don't doubt the badge. You doubt that someone like me has the right to hold it." No one moved, but the atmosphere locked, rigid and breathless. Even the flags lining the hills seemed to stop swaying. No one saw exactly when Renshaw drew his weapon. There was only the sharp click, and then the Glock was out, aimed square at Harrington's chest. A bead of sweat slipped down her temple, not from fear, but from offense. Not offense to her personally, but to an entire generation who had fallen before her. From 3 rows back, a military cadet lifted his phone. A live stream began. The screen shook slightly, but the image was crystal clear. Renshaw's face flushed red, his hand trembling on the trigger, and Harrington, a black woman in full dress uniform, holding a gray urn at a funeral, unarmed, unmoved, unyielding, stood there, as if she alone were placing America's past and present on trial. 3 minutes later, the video went viral. No one needed to say a word, because in that one moment, the gun, the silence, the stare, and a woman who refused to bow, an entire nation heard everything. As a live stream from Fairlawn National Cemetery raced across social media, most viewers assumed they were witnessing yet another heartbreaking episode. A black woman, disrespected by a white officer, at a sacred place of mourning. They didn't know her name. They didn't know who she was. All they saw was a woman in uniform, being held at gunpoint, while cradling a silver gray urn, at a funeral. But within 6 hours, the whole country knew the woman was General Elise Harrington, a 4-star general in the United States Army. The same woman who had once led the mission to extract 18 soldiers held captive by insurgents in Kandahar. The one who crossed the Syrian border on an op no one else would take, and came back carrying 3 wounded men on her own back. And more than anything, the one who twice refused a Pentagon promotion just to stay in the field with her troops. To her, command wasn't about a desk. It was about going where fear lived and showing others what courage really looked like. No headline needed to tell her story. No veteran organization had to explain her silence as she stood before a gun, unshaken, unflinching, unbending, was the most complete biography anyone could ever ask for. A wave of reckoning surged. How could someone like her be treated this way? It was no longer a question. It was an indictment, one society leveled against itself. Across military forums, veterans from every generation began sharing stories about General Elise Harrington. Some remembered how she gave up her own water rations in the desert for younger troops. Others recalled being wounded, only to have her personally bind their bullet wounds, while other commanders searched for exits. The posts weren't dramatic. They didn't need to be. Each story landed like a slap to the face of the very system that once let Officer Gavin Renshaw aim a gun at her in a place reserved for honoring the fallen. The media didn't ask, "Why is Elise silent?" They started asking, "How long have we been silent about things like this?" One female journalist sat stunned as she remembered she had written a profile on Renshaw 2 years earlier, praising him as the guardian of tradition at Fairlawn Cemetery. Now, that same man had aimed a gun at a general because she wasn't on a guest list, or because she was a black woman in uniform in a space where people like her were rarely allowed to be part of the honor. No one said it outright, but everyone felt it. This wasn't a mistake. It was a reflection, a long-suppressed truth bubbling to the surface. That power, protocol, and ceremony were still being used as weapons against those who didn't look the part. General Elise Harrington didn't strike back. She didn't retreat. She simply stood there, holding the urn, eyes fixed, spine straight as command line, and let America confront itself. Within 24 hours of the video's release, the phones at the National Veterans Alliance rang nonstop, not to ask what happened, but to ask, what do we do now? In a meeting room at the Virginia chapter of the Veterans Union, a retired colonel slammed his palm on the table. This isn't about disrespecting one person. It's about aiming a weapon at the spirit of service itself. Meanwhile, at a military academy in Colorado Springs, a senior cadet scrapped his original thesis on tactical assault and presented a new one on the strategy of silence. The first slide, a still image of Elise Harrington, standing motionless before a drawn gun, beneath a flag hanging limp in windless air. Beneath it, a single question: what holds that silence? Other academies followed suit, launching emergency forums and reflection sessions. But the loudest voices came from those who had once worn stars on their collars. A petition was drafted in under 8 hours, titled, "We Demand a Public, Transparent, and Media-Attended Investigation." It wasn't faxed. It was printed on archival-grade parchment, each copy signed by hand, by 37 generals, including 3 who had served at the Pentagon. A spokesperson for the U.S. Armed Forces went live on national television. General Harrington is the embodiment of principle. If she can have a weapon pointed at her in the land of honor, then honor itself is under threat. And then, on Monday morning, a single 14-word message appeared on the homepage of the Department of Justice. "I will testify as a witness, not a victim. Elise Harrington." No logo, no footnote, just one line, and it brought a 2-minute pause to a session of Congress. In a small diner in Fayetteville, a group of veterans quietly stood. They turned toward the wall-mounted television, raised their hands in a military salute as the clip of Harrington played. No one signaled them. No one gave a command. They just knew this silence needed to be answered with action. Elsewhere, social media ignited. People she had once saved, from a private who lost a leg in a hell-manned ambush, to an officer rescued from a rebel detention camp, began sharing their truths, not to glorify her, but to ask the question now echoing too loudly to ignore. How could someone like her be treated that way? That question, like a fireball, rolled into every chamber on Capitol Hill, every political podcast, every sidewalk cafe, and one by one, people were forced to ask themselves, if this happened to Elise Harrington, a symbol of principle, discipline, and sacrifice, who among us could be next? Colburn, Virginia, early May. The morning sun couldn't thaw the tension wound tight inside Courtroom 3 of the federal courthouse. Every seat was taken, press packed in shoulder to shoulder. Outside, a crowd stretched 3 city blocks, holding signs that bore no names. Only one line. "If she's not heard, then neither are we." Elise Harrington entered, still in full uniform, for stars glinting at her left shoulder. But her face bore no anger, no pride, only a silence with gravity. The kind only people who've walked through war know how to carry. Across from her sat Gavin Renshaw, former ceremonial security officer at Fairlawn Cemetery, in a pale gray jumpsuit, hands shackled. His stare remained defiant, as if this trial wasn't judging him, but testing whether America had the courage to look in the mirror. His defense attorney rose, his voice cool, cutting. "My client followed procedure. If there is blame to place, it lies with the system that built him." The room stiffened. No one responded. Elise didn't sit at the witness stand. When called to speak, she stood, walked to the center of the room, and faced Renshaw directly. No gestures, no salutes. "You didn't aim your weapon at me," she said, voice steady, reaching the rear doors like a bell through marble. "You aimed it at the only thing this uniform stands for, honor." A minute of silence stretched, like the echo inside a stone vault. She didn't cry. She didn't waver. She simply looked at him, through him, and continued. "I've faced insurgents in Kandahar. Real bullets, real blood. But I've never felt more endangered than in that moment by someone on our side." Renshaw sneered. "You're a military legend. You know I wasn't going to shoot." Elise tilted her head ever so slightly. "I know, but the 8-year-old boy standing 10 feet away didn't. And he'll remember, not the trigger, but the eyes of a man in uniform, pointing a gun at courage itself." Suddenly, the judge called for a 15-minute recess to review a newly submitted video from an anonymous source. The courtroom screen flickered on. Footage from above, captured by an unregistered civilian drone, revealed something the press had never reported. Renshaw hadn't just drawn his weapon. He disengaged the safety. The room went hollow. A law student sobbed openly. An elderly soldier rose from his seat, hand pressed to his heart. When the court resumed, Elise offered no further words. She handed over a single document, a copy of her 2021 promotion refusal letter, bearing a handwritten note. "I do not serve to stand above others. I serve so no one is stepped on." The verdict was delivered at 3:42 p.m. Life imprisonment. No parole. No applause. No cheers. Just a collective exhale of a room that had been sitting on a live grenade. Renshaw stood. No bowed head. No apology. "I am a product of the silence you all upheld for decades," he growled. "If I'm being buried today, it's with the shovel you handed me." Elise didn't respond. She simply turned her face, not from Renshaw, but from what had made him possible. Outside the courthouse, there was no singing, no parade, only a sea of silent people, arms raised, holding sheets of white paper that read, "Silence is a choice, but not today." When the sentence was handed down, Gavin Renshaw didn't flinch. He stared forward, that twisted half-smile curling at the corner of his mouth, as if clutching some secret the court had overlooked. But what he didn't know was that his real sentence had only just begun. Within 3 days, his name was scrubbed from all official records at the Federal Strategic Training Academy in Virginia, where he had once been hailed as a model of enforcement discipline. The portrait that once hung in the main hallway was taken down. Quietly, no memo, no ceremony. The wall was repainted in a rush, the shade slightly off, leaving a pale, cold silhouette, like a scar, across police academy websites, where quotes from Renshaw had once been cited as examples of firm leadership. His words were replaced with error 404 messages. Some cadets joked, even the browser doesn't want to remember him. At the Strategic Security Bureau headquarters in Colburn, his nameplate was removed from the honors plaque, but instead of replacing it, they left it blank, a dull metal slab with a quiet engraving underneath. "This is where we once went wrong," in a Capitol Hill cafe, where Renshaw had once held informal press briefings. A young barista refused to serve a customer known to have worked with him. When asked why, she smiled and simply said, "Here, we don't serve memory." Soon after, on legal forums and ethics discussion boards, a new term began to circulate, the Renshaw effect. No one called him by title, no rank, no footnote. He had become a synonym for moral collapse, a living case study, no longer needing explanation. At the federal prison where Gavin Renshaw was serving his sentence, his inmate profile photo was found face down in the system file. On the front cover, where his full name should have been, there was only a single word, crossed out in red ink, consequence. There was no press conference to announce his erasure, but across the corridors of power, in lecture halls and training manuals, his absence spoke louder than his legacy ever could. He wasn't deleted by order, but by the resolve of society that had finally learned not to celebrate the man who once pointed a gun at honor itself. 3 weeks after the historic trial in Colburn, Virginia, a cold gray morning settled over Ashfield Military Cemetery, mist clinging to headstones like old regrets. No one gave orders. There was no media campaign, but people started coming. First, a single white sheet of paper taped to the east wall, then 10, then hundreds. By the 10th day, the 30-foot steel panel had been entirely covered with handwritten notes, white paper, yellow slips, torn envelopes, each one a confession, not to Elise Harrington, but to the truth they had once ignored. A nurse wrote anonymously, "I treated a man beaten by police. When asked, I said he fell down the stairs." A veteran left a note that read, "I once stood under the flag he waved. Today, I bow not for him, but for the one he aimed at." A 9th grader from Wisconsin wrote, "I'm sorry I once asked, what's wrong if they look like criminals?" No one organized it. No one filmed. There were no microphones. But each person stood before the wall, as if speaking to a part of themselves they had tried to bury. On the 12th day, a group of architecture students from the University of New Haven erected a hollow steel frame, 10 feet tall, beside the wall. No flag, no name, only a small, hand-etched plaque, a space for the wind to carry words unspoken. They called it the Hollow Core of Memory. Elise Harrington never came. No one saw her. But that morning, A blank white page appeared among the others. No name, no message, only a single blue fingerprint, pressed lightly in the lower right corner. No confirmation was needed. No questions were asked. In the stillness, people understood. Silence was not retreat. It was confrontation. A reply that required no reply. The wall needed no speeches. It asked for no forgiveness. It only demanded that people stand still, face the truth, and for once, not look away. There was no statue, no holiday in her name, no postage stamp, no honorary scholarship. But in classrooms, from the capital to the rural Midwest, her name surfaced every week, not as a symbol, but as a blade, placed squarely at the heart of the lesson. At Colburn Military Academy, where Renshaw's tactics were once taught in crowd control modules, week 8 of the semester, now opened with a single line on the slide deck, not because she didn't act, but because she refused at the right moment, so the whole system had to stop. That day's lecture did not begin with material. It began with silence. A 12-second video played. No sound, no music. Harrington, standing still at a funeral, unarmed, unflinching, her gaze locked on a small boy trembling in the last row. No dialogue, no movement. The screen went black, and the classroom fell into absolute stillness. A student whispered. She didn't need a slogan. She was a living question. At Colburn Law School, senior students were assigned an essay on the concept of the refusal that cannot be refused. One group chose to reenact the trial, but placed 2 bare cinder blocks in the witness stand. When asked why, they replied, because no platform is high enough for someone who chose to stand low and still face justice eye to eye. But amid the lectures and reflections, a moment came that silenced the country all over again. At a National Security Strategy Symposium at the Colburn Defense Institute, General Malcolm Vey, retired, a longtime defender of Renshaw in military doctrine, unexpectedly stepped on stage. He carried an old, battered rucksack. Before hundreds of officers, he opened it, pulled out a frayed black notebook, and read aloud, "I once wrote that pressure is a tool of control. Today, I rewrite that. Pressure is the evidence of a system that's lost its way." The room froze. Vey did not apologize. He bowed once, then left the podium, leaving the notebook under the spotlight, exposed. That simple act traveled fast, across academies, across faculty halls. Professors began demanding curriculum updates. For the first time in 3 decades, a strategic concept was retired not for being inaccurate, but for being morally bankrupt. In the weeks that followed, at universities like Redwood, Baylor, and even Virginia Institute of Public Affairs, a single question appeared in bold. On the philosophy of power final exam, what will you do when silence becomes betrayal? No one called Harrington a saint. No one called her a symbol. But students started using her name as a verb, to Harrington something, to refuse at the precise moment, so no one else can look away. And in the clean white halls of law libraries across the country, students would be seen, placing a palm gently on the covers of their textbooks, not to pray, but as if checking whether their own spines were still straight enough to stand with truth. One week after the lecture at Colburn, a quiet phenomenon swept through military libraries, academic websites, and even local radio stations. Not a scandal, not a campaign, a withdrawal, orderly, decisive, silent, on the clean white homepage of the National Strategic Archive, where once thousands of entries bore the name Gavin Renshaw. Every link now redirected to a single sentence. This material no longer reflects current ethical standards. No explanation needed. Everyone understood. Society was dismantling a monument that had been built the wrong way. At St. Harlan University, a professor of crisis policy studies quietly withdrew a dissertation that had once praised Renshaw as the last keeper of order. No press release, no erratum, He sent a single email to his students. I once believed order was the goal. Now I understand. Legitimacy is the foundation. A political documentary once broadcast on a national politics channel, featuring Renshaw standing before a map, lecturing on the concept of the moral gray zone, was suddenly pulled midstream during a rainy night in Chicago. The following morning, the host tweeted, "I once sat beside him on live television. Today I sit alone and exhale relief." Meanwhile, a group of communication students at Langridge University launched a bold experiment. They recreated Renshaw's most famous quotes, but this time paired them with satirical illustrations. One hand holding a whip, the other blindfolding himself. The room laughed, then went silent. That caricature soon appeared everywhere. No name, no copyright, no ownership. It was plastered in public restrooms, on coffee shop walls near Capitol Hill, and on the community board inside the Federal Police Academy. An elderly man reading one copy muttered, "They used to teach about him like he was sacred. Now he's the joke no one wants to tell." On a popular streaming platform, once home to the podcast Renshaw's Iron Doctrine, a new update replaced every episode with the sound of rain every 60 seconds. A single whispered line played, "When you stay still out of fear, who pays for your silence?" No central committee, no campaign, no formal protest. But the awakening spread like wildfire, quiet, instinctive, irreversible, and that, more than any headline, forced a nation to reflect. Not everyone with a microphone holds power. Sometimes it's the one who pulls back, at the right time, in the right place, who speaks the loudest. Silence didn't disappear in a roar. It faded beneath the rising tide of questions, echoing through lecture halls, prison corridors, and front-page columns of the morning press. At Colburn High School, a history teacher scrapped the standard lesson plan and opened the floor for student dialogue. A 17-year-old brown-skinned student stood, voice hoarse but unwavering. If justice really exists, why did General Harrington have to face them alone? At a funeral? No one answered, not because they didn't know, but because they knew too well, and were just now learning how to stop looking away. At the Virginia Federal Correctional Center, once home to a grand portrait of Renshaw, now hangs a simple wooden plaque with white lettering. "Don't teach us the law, unless you also teach us who once bent it." At Camerline Officer Training Academy, standard drills in restraint and tactical response have been replaced. One new course module reads, "Justice doesn't live in the barrel of the gun, but in the one willing to lower it." The only slide in the presentation, a photo of Elise Harrington, standing motionless at the funeral, eyes fixed forward. No words, no movement, and yet the entire room felt seen. At Barrow University School of Journalism, a seasoned professor known for his lectures on media and political power quietly revised one of his old lecture slides. It had once featured a quote by Renshaw. Now, that quote was crossed out. Beside it, handwritten, "We once quoted him as truth. Now ask, why do we stay silent? Just because truth had no host." At Redwood Law School, a group of students drafted a new discussion charter. No slogans, no images, just a single question printed at the top of every handout. Who was left behind while we were clapping? And questions like that didn't cause the system to collapse. They forced it to look at its reflection. Justice was no longer defined by sentences or shackles, but by memory and by the courage to confront the very statues we built and ask, why did we stand still? One autumn morning, sunlight poured through the thin mist, covering the gray brick plaza, outside the main gates of the United States Department of Defense. No red carpet, no ceremony, no orchestra, only a single stonemason, wiping the granite dust from freshly chiseled words into cold, unforgiving stone. If the day comes when you have a gun pointed at you, remember I did not step back. Elise Harrington. No speeches, no press conference. But the inscription needed no explanation. It stood as truth, once ignored, now etched into the ground, where power once looked the other way. No statue was built, no mural unfurled in the square, but in political corridors, in strategic war rooms, on ethics slideshows across military colleges, the rules began to change, not with banners of victory, but with a quiet principle. A mistake must not be repeated, just because it once wore a uniform. At a tactics training class, in the National Security Academy, a young officer paused before the only black and white photo left on the wall, not of Harrington, just an empty space, with a caption, "Honor isn't in the rank, it's in the one who refuses to do wrong." When the whole system says it's allowed, behind a federal prison, where Renshaw now served his sentence, a Newgate officer had just been posted. He was born in 2003, only 10 years old when it all unfolded. When asked if he remembered the trial, he simply replied, "No, but I know she stood still when she could have drawn her weapon. No further reason needed." And so, across the system, from military to justice, from media to education, no proclamations were made, no reforms shouted from rooftops, but quietly, piece by piece, the supports once used to justify the unjust were being removed. No one declared, "We've changed," but people began choosing to stand upright instead of looking down. Harrington said nothing more. No memoir, no book deal, no reappearance on the news, because her message was already carved in stone, not to glorify, but to remind. Some people don't need farewell songs or medals pressed into palms. Just one moment, standing firm beneath threat, to become the spark for a generation that finally understands. Justice doesn't belong to the winner. It belongs to the one who never ran.